All right, guys. Today we're going to look at the question of why Abraham married his sister Sarah. And, I got this question submitted, and then the issue was like, well, honestly, of course Abraham married his sister Sarah. In other words, people do things in the Bible that's wrong, so it doesn't mean that it was like okay for them to do it just because they did it. Like the Bible tells stories of people doing the wrong thing sometimes. So just because Abraham did something doesn't mean that it was the right thing to do. In fact, in the story where he talks about him, being married to his sister, he's also telling a lie, and it causes a lot of problems and God's angry, and that sort of thing. So just because Abraham did something, that doesn't mean that it's okay to do. It's just telling the story of what he actually did. But the thing is, I started looking into this. It appears that Abraham didn't marry his sister Sarah. And so let's dig into that. Okay, so first of all, Genesis 20:11, Abraham does this little thing where he goes down to Egypt and he's worried that they're going to want to steal his wife away because she's pretty. And so he says, she's my sister, because the idea would be that in the ancient world, if you wanted her to be your wife, you would have to kill her husband. But he does it twice. He does it another time with, I think it's Ahimelech or Abimelech. Genesis 20:11 is the passage that we're focusing on here. Abraham replied, I said to myself, surely there is no fear of God in this place, for they will kill me because of my wife. That's what I was talking about. And then Abraham says, besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, straight say of me, he is my brother. So they lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in basically Ur in southern Mesopotamia. The Chaldeans were not from there. They were like a people group that had come in, and so many of them had come in that they basically had sort of become Mesopotamian and were running the place. They left from there and went to this place called Haran, which is sort of in Syria-ish. And then Abraham left from his father's household and went down to what would eventually become Israel. They called it the land of Canaan in those days. Okay, but there's this issue. He's lying about her not being his wife. We have to be careful. Well, how do we really know that he's not lying about her being his sister? In other words, he's like, oh, well, he's, in other words, they're mad at him for lying about this. And he's like, oh, well, she really is my sister, though, my half-sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, etc., etc., etc. So Abraham's credibility isn't real great on this point. But the first thing I want to point out is, was she really his sister? Okay. All right, so let's look at some stuff. All right. Abraham was 10 years older than Sarah. So that's his wife. Now, his name was Abram, and then God changes it to Abraham, and then her name is Sarai, and God changed it to Sarah. Basically, the name Yahweh is God's name, and it starts with this Aleph letter, and he basically kind of adds Aleph to both their names. So God's putting his stamp on Abraham and Sarah. He gives them this name change. I'll just use their names that became like their final names, Abraham and Sarah. So it says, Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And he laughs. And it's funny because the child that she does bear, they thought it was a joke that she would, both of them would have a kid when they're so old. The kid is called Laughter. That's what Isaac means. But anyway, right there, he's 100, she's 90. Okay? I think it's more like he's 99, or I think he's 100 though. He's saying he's 100 there. All right, so he's 10 years older. Abraham's 10 years older than his wife. Okay? Then we get Abraham's dad, Terah, died at 205 years old. This is in Genesis 11:32. Terah lived 205 years, and then he died in Haran. Okay, so that's that land they moved to when they moved out of Ur. They moved to Haran, and then Abraham separated from them and moved to, Canaan. Terah was 70 when Abraham was born. This is Genesis 11:26. After Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So another guy named Haran, although in the Bible they spell it slightly differently because these are copied and pasted. So I'm not sure exactly what the deal is there on Haran, but we're not going to go into that. So therefore Abraham was 205 minus 70, 135 years old when Terah died. So when Terah, his father, died, so Terah lived till he was 70, had Abraham, and lived to 205. Okay, and these ages are a whole other question, like what's up with these long ages, especially given that Abraham thinks he's not going to be able to have a kid at 100. His dad had him at 70, So he was 135 years old when Terah died. Okay? So just keep these facts in mind. All right. Sarah died at 127 years old. Genesis 23:1. The first verse of that, Genesis 27, says Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She dies. Abraham buries her. There's this whole story about Abraham officially buying a cave for his wife to be buried in, and his other family members eventually, so they make it official. So therefore Abraham was 137 years old, right, 10 years older than her when Sarah died. His father died 2 years earlier when Abraham was 135. Okay, so his dad dies when he's 135 and his wife dies when he's 137. All right. Although he does have a later wife, but that's a whole other story. Abraham's father died while Abraham was still living in Haran. So you see the problem? Okay. So this is from Acts 7:4. So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you are now living. That would be, the promised land, the land of Israel. So Abraham had lived in Canaan more than 2 years before Sarah died, right? So in other words, according to Acts 7:4, his dad died before Abraham moved to Canaan. But what we find out in Genesis is, Abraham had lived in Canaan. It was enough time for him to have his first son Ishmael with Sarah's Egyptian slave, and Ishmael could learn to speak, and then Isaac too, all before Sarah died, because Sarah has to be alive to give birth to Isaac. Okay, so all that happens while they're living in Canaan. In other words, the father of Abraham who died before the move to Canaan was not Terah. So that could be really confusing for us, but the Bible presents this as like no big deal, it's not confusing. Why is it not confusing for them? Answer: in this time and place, you would refer to your grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, etc., as simply as your father. So they didn't draw a distinction between father, great-grandfather, grandfather, great-great-grandfather. They didn't draw a distinction. They just called all of those your father. Going back to the book of Acts, same chapter, Acts 7:32, because this is where in Acts Stephen retells these stories. This is God speaking to Moses, and he says, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. So all of those are his fathers. And in fact, that the word fathers appears in Acts, but in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, it's I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right, so you would refer to all of your male ancestors as your father. Okay? So that was just the terminology of the time. They didn't have a different word for that. They just used that word for all of that. Okay. Male cousins and other male relatives were referred to as brothers. So here in Genesis 13:8, so Abram, this is before the name change, said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. That's how the modern NIV translates it, but it's not literal. So we go back to the 1995 New American NASB. So Abraham said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Literally, it's brothers. So he calls Lot his brother. All right, so Lot is not his brother. Lot is his brother's son, his nephew. Okay, we'll look at that. When Abram had heard that his relative had been taken captive, this is when Lot got captured, he led out his trained men born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan, which it wasn't called Dan at that time, so it's written at a later time when the names and locations changed. And then this is also in the 1995 NASB, and they translate it as relative, but there's a footnote, and I left there, they put their little footnotes in there, and the footnote in the 1995 New American Standard Bible says it's actually literally brother, not relative. So we have this term relative, or close relative, or nephew, or niece, or cousin. They just say brother for all of that. Okay, your brother. All right. So they don't draw a distinction between like your brother, and your cousin, and your nephew, or some sort of male relative. Those are all just your brothers. Okay. Lot was Abraham's nephew. All right, going to Genesis 11:27, it says, now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. So that's his nephew, but he calls him his brother both times. So Nahor is said to be Terah's son along with Abraham. Genesis 11, Nahor is the father of Bethuel, who is the father of Rebekah. So Haran is the father of Lot, but there's also this guy Nahor. He's the father of Bethuel, and Bethuel is the father of Rebekah. So Genesis 22:23, Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. All right, and then this is Rebekah talking later in Genesis 24:24. She said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. So in our terminology, this would make Rebekah the second cousin once removed of Isaac, who is the son of Abraham. So Abraham had Isaac, and then Rebekah would be his second cousin once removed. But Isaac does the same little thing where he's worried people are going to kill him to take his wife, so he says she's his sister. He does the same thing as Father Abraham did. He may be lying, but it fits with the usage of brother for a cousin. In other words, he says she's my sister. But she's his second cousin once removed. So when the men, this is the Genesis 26:7, when the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, she is my sister, for he was afraid to say my wife, thinking the men of the place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. Thus, if Abraham calls Sarah his sister, the daughter of his father, this might mean second cousin. He may be referring to a grandfather or great-grandfather who is the ancestor of both of them. She may be a second or third cousin. We don't know. So that's the terminology. I should say, well, let's point out that the terminology in the other direction, when you're looking, can be specific. So when you're looking at your ancestors, they will just say, and well, let's just say in the other direction, Genesis 11:31 refers to Lot as the grandson of Terah. That's how they translate it. If you look, I was able to look into the Hebrew, and the word is literally Ben. So like, my name is Ben, and Ben it just means son. So if you call him a Ben, that's like saying son. Thus, distinctions were made when talking about descendants, but distinctions, if you look backwards into the past, at your ancestors, or sideways at your cousins and siblings and that sort of thing, you just would say brother or sister. And you look into your ancestors, you would just say father. But if you look forward in time, you would say that Terah's, actually they had a word for grandson, even though they didn't have a word for grandfather or great-grandfather. And grandson just Ben. It's just like son. I kind of like that one. So he called his grandson his Ben. Because Ben means son. And so his grandson is his Ben. Okay. Son. All right. Interestingly, this same verse, Genesis 11:31, refers to Sarah as the daughter-in-law. They have a word for that, daughter-in-law, or like son's wife of Terah instead of as Terah's daughter. Because it says that she is Terah's daughter-in-law. It's like, I forgot the word, it's like Kala or something. Because she is the wife of Abraham. Okay, so given that Abraham was lying about Sarah not being his wife, he could have been lying completely about her being his sister. We have no reason to think that she was his sister other than that he said she was, but we already know he lied about stuff like that. But even if he was telling the truth about saying he was his sister, she could have been a second or third cousin in their terminology. All right. Now, just to point out final points, Genesis examines stories where, and it really, the first 5 books of the Bible, you have later laws that are given to Moses, and you have earlier stories in Genesis. And Genesis doesn't always say, that was wrong that they did that. There's some sort of negative result from them doing something wrong, but it is assumed that the person reading Genesis is familiar with the law. And the evidence for that is, let's see. All right. It says, Abraham heard his relative or his brother had been taken captive. He led his trained men born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. The land of Dan wasn't called Dan because Dan is a descendant of Isaac's son Jacob. And Isaac's son Jacob had 12 sons, and they became the 12 tribes of Israel, and they conquered the land of Canaan and renamed everything. And that took hundreds of years for that to happen. So Genesis was clearly written hundreds of years after the days of Abraham, in the days when the land had been turned into, Israel. It had become, and so in other words, they had to use the name that the people at the time would have understood. So in other words, the laws of Moses were already available to people, when Genesis was written. So Genesis might not explain, hey, that was wrong, that was against God's law, because it's written at a time when people already had those laws. So, Jacob, for example, the son of Isaac, he marries Rachel and Leah. He marries a woman and her sister. He's tricked into doing it. He doesn't want to do it, but he does it. But it does result in an intense rivalry that causes division, and the division and the rivalry continues on into the next generation among their children. The rivalry, because Rachel was the one that Jacob actually wanted to marry. She was pretty, but then she couldn't have... Well, actually, it says Leah had weak eyes. We don't know exactly what it means to have weak eyes. But Rachel couldn't really have children as well as Leah, so that became a source of competition. And then Leah's children are the ones who get mad at Joseph because Jacob shows favoritism towards Joseph, and then they sell him into slavery and tell their dad that he's dead. We also have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which shows an extreme punishment for various forms of rape, just as an example. But hopefully that answers the question. Thank you guys for anyone who's been paying attention to a little bit of, essentially what we have going on here is what's called let me write it and we'll finish up with this. What's called an anachronism. An anachronism is when you misunderstand the past because you see the past from the perspective of the future, and the future is actually quite different from the past. Just in the way that they talked about their family members and the terminology, we don't really have a word that means what father meant in the way they used it, and they don't really have a word that means what father means in the way we use it, because the way they use the word father, it included a bunch of things that we don't really have a word that includes as many things as they included in that word. And the way we use the word father, is more specific, and they don't really have a word that's as specific as that. But it's interesting, they did have a word for grandson, which is fairly specific. Anyway, that is it for today's question and answer video. Thank you so much for your time.